Hi, this is Derek Jones with Devotionables, brief devotions for busy people. And today we're going to be reading out of Psalm 38, and we're going to be looking at what God has in store for us through this Psalm of David. So starting in verse 3, we first see David is describing a really tough time that I think there's probably most of us can relate to. A time where he's feeling burdened and overcome by sin. David describes his sin as a burden that is too much to bear. In verse 3 through 4, he says, "There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There's no health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me." When I read that, it's so visceral and it hits me hard. And I think about how sin, as David describes it, it isn't just impacting his spiritual life. David is describing how the burden of sin is affecting him physically, and it's physically impacting his well-being. He's so weighed down by his sin, by guilt, by regret. And again, I think those are all things that each of us can relate to, and maybe even some of you who are listening can empathize with right now. When David in verse 6 starts talking about his current reality, he describes his suffering as making him physically weak, emotionally crushed, and even his friends are keeping their distance from him. Verse 11 says, "My friends and companions stand aloof from my plague, and my nearest kin stand far off." Sometimes when we go through struggles, whether it's due to sin or hardship in our life, we feel alone. And sometimes the reality is we are alone here physically. But it's a good reminder, and we'll turn in a moment to David's kind of conclusion, that even in those moments where we feel alone and isolated, God is still near, God is still with us. And so in 38:15, we see David start to cry out. Despite his pain, David encourages us not to turn away from God. And instead, he turns to him. He says in verse 15, "Lord, I wait for you, and you will answer, Lord my God." God's mercy is always greater than our failures. It's always greater than our sin. And David, I think through this verse, is encouraging us. We don't have to sit in our guilt, in our shame. We can turn back to God and abide in Him. So when we think about this chapter, as I was reading through it, again, this hit me very hard personally. It's a reminder that there are times that we're going to go through where we sin, we fall short, and the effects of that sin are real, both spiritually and physically. But I hope that we take encouragement and get our own hope from David's conclusion that even in those moments, we're never alone. God is always near. God is always pursuing us. And that if we will wait on God, if we will turn to God, then we will see and feel His presence and see that He was pursuing us all along. So I hope you find hope in this chapter this week. And my prayer for you is the same as David's, that we would just turn to God.